In the Middle Ages, laws were strict, but it wasn't just people who were judged back then. Imagine city squares, stern judges, lawyers, and in the dock, rats. Why did animals become defendants in criminal cases? Why could rats be sentenced to death or exile? And what secret fears lay behind these absurd trials? Today, we will travel to a place where the line between reality and mysticism was almost blurred. Welcome to the world of the most insane trials of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, a period shrouded in a fog of ignorance, superstition, and endless struggle for survival. At that time, the world seemed like a living organism, where every element, every animal, and every natural phenomenon had a will and intention. And if a person could be brought to trial for their actions, why not hold an animal accountable if it violated the order? Animal trials are so strange to the modern mind that they seem like a hoax or someone's joke. But court records show that all this happened in earnest. Pigs, bulls, goats, dogs, even insects, and, of course, rats, became defendants in criminal cases, in the dusty halls of city councils and in squares filled with the sound of bells. Animals listened to accusations, were assigned defenders, and were sentenced. Sometimes they were executed, sometimes exiled. Sometimes they were acquitted. But rats occupy a special place in this series of trials. Cunning, elusive, omnipresent creatures that, in the eyes of medieval man, were something more than just pests. They seemed to be emissaries of evil, messengers of chaos, violators of God's order. This story is not just a tale of strange trials. It is a journey into the very heart of the medieval worldview, where the line between reality and myth was as thin as smoke above a bonfire. Join us. Today, we will travel to a place where the law judged not only people, but also those who moved in the shadows. To understand the strange trials of animals, you need to immerse yourself in the medieval mindset. Back then, the world was perceived as a huge stage where everything had its own meaning, its own role, and its own responsibility to higher powers. Humans, animals, the earth, the stars. Everything was connected by a single divine will. According to canon law, animals could violate the divine and human order, and therefore be punished for it. A pig that killed a child or a bull that trampled a peasant were not perceived as irrational creatures, but as criminals who had violated natural law. They became the perpetrators of tragedies, demanding justice like any sinner. And this was not just a matter of religion. Secular authorities also held trials of animals to assert the authority of the law and show that order was paramount, even if the criminal was not human. Rats posed a particular challenge. They were difficult to catch and impossible to bring to court, but the damage they caused to crops, food, and the well-being of entire communities was enormous. If a rat destroyed grain reserves, leaving people to starve, who else but the rat was to blame for the disaster? In some cases, trials were not held for the sake of real punishment, but as a symbolic act of expelling evil. The court was a ritual. Prayers, incantations, formal summonses to court, public readings of charges. All this was perceived as a struggle not just against a physical enemy, but against a metaphysical violation of order. Sometimes the trials ended in anathema, a church curse on the animals. Sometimes sentences were handed down to expel the entire rodent population from the city or village. Symbolism played a primary role. The moral integrity of the community was restored through the court. Thus, the trial of animals was part of a comprehensive worldview in which even a rat could appear before the highest authority, a human court, for its crimes against the established order. In this strange but surprisingly logical ritual for its time, the Middle Ages reveals its fears, its beliefs, and its attempts to explain incomprehensible disasters. When it comes to animal trials in the Middle Ages, stories that are both absurd and terrifying immediately come to mind. The cases recorded in the archives are striking for the thoroughness with which the courts of the time approached accusations against creatures that knew no law. One of the most famous trials was the execution of a pig in the town of Falaise, France, in 1386. The pig was found guilty of murdering a child. It was sentenced to have its front leg cut off and then be publicly executed by hanging. The local authorities took the trial very seriously. They hired a lawyer, drew up charges, and called witnesses. In another case, in 1496, in the Cévennes region of France, the bishop's court brought a case against a swarm of caterpillars that had eaten vineyards. The insects were officially charged with damaging the harvest and ordered to leave the area within 3 days. Of course, the caterpillars did not obey, but the expulsion ceremony was carried out with all the necessary rites. Bulls, buffaloes, and even goats were also brought to trial. In 1480, in the city of Lausanne, modern-day Switzerland, a bull was sentenced to death for goring a farmer to death. Witness testimony confirming the animal's evil temper played a decisive role in the sentencing. Collective trials were common. In the Swiss canton of Bern in the 15th century, a trial was held against a swarm of locusts. The court ruled that the insects should be immediately expelled from the city limits. Of course, legal measures were of little help in combating such invasions. Some courts showed remarkable humanity. For example, in the city of Avignon in the 16th century, rats accused of destroying crops were officially summoned to court. They were assigned a lawyer, Bartolomé Chasson, an expert in law, who built his defense on the grounds that his clients could not safely appear at the hearing due to hostility from local cats. All these trials seem crazy from a modern perspective, but for people in the Middle Ages, they were an attempt to bring order to a world full of chaos and danger. The law seemed to have to cover everything that was alive. Even the smallest, most invisible creature could be held accountable before society and God. These stories are not just curiosities. They deeply reflect the spirit of their time, when there was no clear line between humans and the rest of nature, between crime and curse, between punishment and purification. Among all the trials of animals, a special place is occupied by a case that unfolded in the town of Autun, Burgundy region, France, in the mid-16th century. This trial became a classic example of medieval legal absurdity, attracting the attention of even modern historians. The story began with a disaster. Rats flooded the fields, destroying crops and threatening the city's food security. Autun was on the brink of starvation. The city authorities decided to act with the full force of the law. A criminal case was brought against the rats. The first step was to formally present the charges. The diocesan prosecutor formulated the indictment. The rats were accused of maliciously eating grain crops, which caused serious damage to the community and threatened its existence. By law, the animals were granted the right to defense. The famous lawyer Bartolomé Chasson was appointed as their defense attorney. His task was not only difficult, but also somewhat comical: to defend creatures that could not speak, could not appear in court, and, moreover, did not recognize the jurisdiction of human law. Chastain approached the case with the utmost seriousness. At the first hearing, he stated that his clients could not appear in court for objective reasons. The journey to the court was fraught with danger, as cats, the natural enemies of rats, roam the streets. Consequently, the rats' failure to appear could not be interpreted as an admission of guilt or disrespect for the court. The court took this statement into account and ordered the city authorities to ensure safe passage for the rats to the courtroom. Of course, this requirement was impossible to fulfill in practice. The rats did not appear. At the next hearing, the prosecutor demanded that a verdict be handed down in absentia. However, Chasson objected, insisting that his clients were entitled to sufficient time to appear and to conditions that would ensure their safety. He referred to the principles of justice set forth in canon law, arguing that a trial without the presence of the accused was contrary to the foundations of justice. The judges, finding themselves in an absurd situation, were forced to adjourn the proceedings. After several postponements and endless legal debates, the trial was effectively frozen. Historians still argue whether the entire trial was a deliberate farce designed to distract the people from their hardships and morally cleanse the community through symbolic action, or whether it was taken seriously by those involved. One thing is certain: for Bartolomé Chasson, the trial was the pinnacle of his legal career. His defense, based on the principles of legality and the rights of the accused, went down in history as an example of how formal legal norms can reduce any situation to absurdity. This case reflected the main features of the medieval worldview: the belief that the law applies to all beings without exception, the need for symbolic purification of the community from misfortune through judicial action, a sense of helplessness in the face of the forces of nature, which was transformed into an attempt to subject chaos to the logic of human laws. The trial in Othello was not just a curiosity, but a mirror of an era where the boundaries between reality and ritual were blurred. Rats, small, inconspicuous creatures, became the embodiment of evil against which the very order of the universe rebelled, albeit in such a strange and ineffective form. The defense of animals in court is one of the most surprising aspects of medieval trials. In full compliance with legal formalities, animals were assigned lawyers, often highly respected jurists, whose task was to defend the rights of their unusual clients. Lawyers built their defenses along various lines. One of the main arguments was doubt about guilt. They pointed out that it was impossible to identify the specific animal that had committed the crime. In the case of rats or locusts, this was even more so. It was impossible to separate the guilty from the innocent among millions of individuals. Another popular tactic was to appeal to natural instincts. The defense attorneys argued that animals act according to their nature and therefore cannot be convicted for what is programmed into them by nature itself. A pig attacks not out of malice, but out of fear or excitement. A rat eats grain to survive. Some lawyers resorted to more sophisticated arguments, citing the inadequacy of the conditions of the indictment. For example, in the Autun trial, Bartolomé Chasson obtained delays by pointing out that his clients could not safely appear in court, which violated their right to defense. Court proceedings often turned into a veritable legal theater, with the parties trying to outdo each other in wit and references to canon law. The judges, often perplexed by the absurdity of what was happening, were nevertheless forced to follow established procedures. The sentences handed down to animals also varied. In the case of individual animals, such as pigs or bulls, they were sentenced to death by hanging, drowning, or burning. Sentences were often carried out in public as an act of intimidation and restoration of the disturbed order. In the case of entire populations, rats, locusts, caterpillars, exorcism rituals were used. The courts read out the sentence condemning these creatures to exile from the land, prayed for their departure, and sometimes organized processions to drive away the disaster. Justice in these trials was mostly symbolic. They almost never had any real effect. But in the eyes of medieval people, it was an act of resistance against chaos, an expression of faith that law and order could be restored even in the face of natural disasters. The role of lawyers in these processes is a special chapter. They show that even in the strangest and most hopeless cases, the law sought formal justice. And this is one of the most paradoxical but touching features of the Middle Ages. The desire to bring order to a world where almost everything was subject to the elements and chance. The Middle Ages cannot be understood without taking into account the mystical aura that surrounded everything that existed. People looked for signs from above in every phenomenon, good or ominous omens, and rats, such inconspicuous but destructive creatures, personified dark forces in people's minds. Rats were associated with damage, disease, and death. They came secretly, spread like lightning, destroyed food supplies, leaving behind hunger and despair. Outbreaks of the plague that ravaged Europe further cemented the reputation of rats as messengers of evil, although at that time few understood how the disease was transmitted. Priests in their sermons depicted rats as instruments of Satan, through which sin and destruction entered the world. In engravings of the time, rats were depicted accompanying witches, demons, and other servants of darkness. Therefore, the trial in Autun and others like it were not simply legal farces. They were perceived as sacred acts aimed at expelling evil from human space. The trial of the rats was both an act of justice and a ritual of purification. The church practice of excommunicating animals from the church, anathema, shows how seriously people took the fight against unclean nature. Rats were not simply condemned for material damage. They were perceived as violators of the spiritual order. Some chronicles report that in particularly severe cases, processions were held against rats, with prayers, the consecration of fields, and the sprinkling of grain reserves with holy water. These were attempts to create a magical boundary between the world of humans and the world of destruction. Thus, rats in the Middle Ages were not only a physical threat, but also a symbol of fear of forces that humans could not control. Trials against them became part of the struggle to preserve the boundaries between good and evil, order and chaos. And in this strange, superstition-filled world, rats were tried not so much for eating grain as for an invisible war between light and darkness, in which every action had to be carried out according to the laws of both the earthly and heavenly worlds. Today, trials of animals make us smile or shake our heads in disbelief. But behind this strange practice lies an important lesson about the nature of human society. Trials of rats, pigs, and other animals show how deeply rooted in people is the desire for order and justice, even in the face of inexplicable chaos. Faced with disaster, the people of the Middle Ages did not give up. They sought ways to make sense of what was happening, to fit tragedies into a system of justice and morality that they understood. These trials remind us that belief in the law, in justice, and in the need for a moral response to any violation of order are universal traits of human civilization. Even if the forms this belief has taken have changed over the centuries. The trial of the rats is not just a strange page in the history of law. It is a mirror that reflects the fears, hopes, and ineradicable desire of people to establish order in an unpredictable world.